An interesting and timely topic about getting China policy right. We have a lot of experience of getting China policy wrong. And over the years, every new presidential administration comes in and has a policy debate and resets the dial a little bit, the dial between cooperation and confrontation, or cooperation and competition, or cooperation and engagement, but the dial goes back and forth. And as you know, at the moment, it's pretty far turned over to the competition side of the spectrum. This has launched U.S. policy in a new direction. It's taken us into the terrain of trade wars, intensified military competition, and we'll see what the net effect turns out to be. But this question of how to get China policy right is with us for the long term, because obviously the China-U.S. relationship is emerging as one of the most central dynamics of the 21st century, economically, politically, ideologically, but also from a security perspective. We could have no better speaker than today's speaker, Dr. Tom Fingar, to lead us into some discussion on this topic. Tom launched his career at Stanford with a PhD in comparative politics in 1977. He then spent a decade at Stanford doing research and analysis on Asian security issues, which earned him a phone call to come to Washington and do that analysis with a focus originally on China in the State Department. And for a couple of decades, he moved with a broadening portfolio inside the State Department and then also in the intelligence community, and ultimately served both as chairman of the National Intelligence Council and as the inaugural, I have it written down here somewhere, the first deputy director of the National Intelligence for Analysis. And being an analytically inclined guy, working intel issues and working them in a period of perhaps the most intense politicization of intel, particularly on WMD, when he came back to Stanford in 2009, he wrote the book on intelligence analysis and national security called Reducing Uncertainty. And this is considered the premier contribution on this topic from someone who's worked both the analytical side and the policy side. But he's spending most of his creative energies on the U.S.-China relationship and has produced a string of volumes of one kind or another on this topic, indeed going back more years than either of us would care to count. Upon returning to Stanford, he joined the Freeman Spogli Institute. This is the International Affairs umbrella organization at Stanford. He's a fellow in APARC, the Asia Pacific Research Center, and a good friend, and I'm pleased to welcome him back to the laboratory. Tom Fingar.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brad, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for giving up a portion of your workday. I realize this means you have to work harder later in the day or later in the week. That I appreciate the opportunity. I've been coming to the lab for 30-odd years now and again for conversations, and it is always worth my time, both to hear the questions and to garner the observations that people make on the topics that I'm interested in. What I want to address this morning, and excuse me, I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, is the importance of getting U.S. policy towards China right. This is a relationship that matters. I realize that stating that is in many ways to state something that's obvious and therefore not very important. But it's important, in my perspective, it's important for the people, the institutions of both countries. The amount of interaction, the way in which we can and cannot engage with one another is important to the stability, the security, the prosperity, and realization of potential in both countries. It's also important for lots of third countries in the region and beyond. That it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that on a host of issues, countries, particularly in the region, don't want to be forced to choose between political values, security relationship with the United States, and economic trade relationships with China. That for the decades of the Cold War, these were seen as two sides of the same coin. Now they are seen as something in opposition or contradistinction. A third way it's important is on global issues. Climate change, global warming, nuclear and other WMD proliferation, urbanization, demographic change. That, again, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that most of the world is and will remain reluctant to commit political capital, technological and scientific efforts, budgetary resources to dealing with major challenges that confront every people, every country, so long as they worry that either the United States or China will veto, will try to pull the rug out. That if the two big players are not on basically the same page, why would a mid-range power, let alone a smaller country, begin to commit resources? Because this is all zero-sum. To be effective, a policy has to be well grounded in understanding of ourselves and of the other players, not just China, the third country. That Brad's introduction did not reveal something that in truth in labeling. I am an analyst of U.S.-China relations, but I'm also a participant observer. I've been directly involved, been doing China for almost 55 years, been directly involved since ping pong in 1972. And in the Ford and the Carter administrations, I was the easily disavowed young trial balloon guy working on specific dimensions of the normalization process. And then in the Reagan administration, I went in as head of the China division. So the now often criticized naivete of American policy towards China over the last 40 years, I'm at least a bit sensitive to that, that charge. And I don't think we were particularly naive. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. I think as I speak, though, you should bear in mind that I think the policy was incredibly successful over the 40 years. That, did it have problems? Yes. Did it lead to places and specific challenges that were not fully anticipated and understood? Yes. But it's in the larger context of the world's changed quite a bit. A lot of things have happened that require and still require course correction. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do this morning is to divide the talk into three non-equal parts. One is my assessment of how we got into the current situation we are in with China, which many characterize as a trade war, and the origins of the prevailing narrative about China and about U.S.-China relations. It's a narrative that includes the policy of engagement. Hedged engagement was mistaken, naive, counterproductive. I gave the preface I did because I don't think that's the case. Then I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that China faces, its aspirations, but also its challenges and constraints. That a lot of the rhetoric in the narrative presumes a China that will evolve in particular ways, which my experience says are not likely to happen. And the third, and much shorter, is to begin what I hope becomes a dialogue around what is a proper way to deal with a China, a United States, a global situation that is as I think it is and is likely to evolve. But let me go first to the current state of U.S.-China relations. That I'm sure anybody in this room, even if only kind of TV news and newspaper op-ed kind of analysis, understands that it's a strained period in this relationship. I would suggest that the state of the relationship, though strained, is somewhat like Wagner's music. As Mark Twain characterized it, Wagner's music isn't nearly as bad as it sounds. U.S.-China relations, though fraught, are not nearly as parlous, as dangerous, as confrontational as is being characterized. Part of the reason I say that is knowledge of history. We've actually been through tougher times before in this relationship. But also, though fraught with many problems, this relationship is not fragile. Over the last 40 years of formal diplomatic relations, going back a few years beyond that to the Nixon-Mao beginning of rapprochement, we have developed multiple connections, people to people, academic institutions, government bureaucracy to government bureaucracy, even military to military, the economic realms. This was in part the deliberate policy of the United States. We started out with a one-pillar relationship. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. When Nixon and Mao shook hands, neither country expected very much of the other. Certainly from the U.S. perspective, China had to do exactly one thing, not move. It had to stay on the eastern border of the Soviet Union. That was all. Didn't have to change its politics, didn't have to be a partner, quasi-ally of the United States. As long as Moscow couldn't be sure that Beijing would remain neutral in a confrontation with the United States, it had a two-front war problem to plan for. And I believe, my reading of the history, the Chinese didn't expect that the United States was going to make technology available, open up its university, start investing capital in China. None of that was a part of the plan or the vision. It changed dramatically after Mao's death, the advent of reform and opening. Indeed, reform and opening, beginning to move towards a more market-based economy, move away from an autarkic economic system when it strove towards being completely self-reliant to one that was integrated in the global system. Highly successful policy for China. Could not have gotten off square one without the United States. That was a prerequisite. If you're going to do export-led growth through engagement with the most developed countries in the world, 1978, that was the free world. The US was the gatekeeper. US was the bigot market. The other developed countries were in the socialist bloc, the Soviet-led bloc. And because of the Sino-Soviet rift, there was no way that Moscow was going to help. This began a period of interaction, a period of engagement that has changed China a lot more than it's changed the United States. That the objective of the Chinese in the 70s was to have a temporary period of engagement with the global system, the US-led global order. Risky because it was US-led. Perfidious Americans might pull the rug out from under this at any time. But get in, get rich, get out. Get in, jumpstart China's economy so that it could then be self-sustaining for modernization, for growth, for improving the lot of the Chinese people, develop the technical capacity to develop its military capabilities to reduce vulnerability. But this was envisioned as temporary, as fraught with perils of dependency. Dependency entails vulnerabilities. It gives leverage to the partners. Most worrisome, the United States, secondarily Japan, broadly the West, the developed world. So China's policy was one of minimizing interdependence, which was another word for dependency and vulnerability. The American perspective, going back, was good luck. You could try to do that, but it won't work. Because the strategy that you've laid out of following the Japanese path, which was really the Taiwan model of development, but no way in the world Beijing was going to say we're following the Taiwan model. We call it the Japan model, export-led growth. That brings China into the rules-based international order that builds upon and develops comparative advantage, divisions of labor, reinforced by production and supply chains. And the US attitude of, you can think you're going to pull out of this at some point, but your development will be increasingly dependent on the degree of involvement in the international system. If you pull out, you stop growing. You stop becoming more sophisticated, more modern. So from a US perspective, a China that stayed in would be transformed by virtue of participation in the rules-based system and becoming another big, highly developed country with people having a stake in order. If China pulled out, it becomes another big, poor country with limited abilities. Neither one was a particularly worrisome problem. Would rather have a successful China than an unsuccessful China, because we know how to manage a successful Japan, a successful European Union. Nobody has any idea how to manage a stumbling giant that China could become. More framing thing of it, I said at the beginning, remarkably successful. China's growth is well known. Almost 4 decades of double-digit growth. It's almost always depicted as unprecedented. It's only unprecedented if you're a China specialist and you don't pay attention to other countries. It's basically the same trajectory as Japan, as South Korea, as Taiwan, as Singapore. It lasts a little longer, about 5 years longer than the other Asian tigers. But it started from a lower base. If you knew nothing except Econ 101, you'd predict this kind of growth until it gets to a level where it slows. So it doesn't look that unique. What is unique is the size of China, the size of the population, the size of the country. But the performance is not, and I will come back to that. We didn't do so badly, we the US, we the developed world more generally. And let me give you a couple of statistics that will make this concrete. When the US and China began this intensive engagement, when China got entry into the free world candy store without having to change its political system or its politics or become a formal ally, it was the first and the only country that got that opportunity. The US economy represented about 26% of the global total. 40 years later, remarkable success in China. Some other, trivial developments like the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union, the expansion of the European Union from 17 to 28 countries, the adoption in most of the non-aligned world of an export-led model of development. The US share of the global economy has decreased, as you would expect. It is now, 40 years later, all the way down to 24.5% of the world economy. But our share of world population fell from 6 to 4.5. So on a per capita basis, we account for more of the world economy than we did before China came into the game. We've got a terrific distribution problem in the United States. Our country has become wealthier. Our people have not. But that's our problem here. And again, make it specific here because it's germane to the second part of my talk. China's per capita GDP, in 1978 was about $600. It's about $9,600 today. Very significant increase. What happened to the United States? We went from 12,000 to 58,000 per capita. Not too bad. That's not too shabby. Again, we've got a distribution problem, but the premise of engagement being mutually beneficial economically, and that the risks of the asymmetries in the relationship, we are more open to China than China is to us. We're more open to everybody than they are to us. It was the key Cold War strategy to make our partners stronger. If partners became stronger, the alliance would become stronger. If the alliance is stronger, we become safer. Simple. If our partners become more prosperous, they buy more stuff from us. We become more prosperous along the way. Win-win. That was the logic of it, and I'll come back to this later. That we didn't do too badly, but we perceive ourselves as having done badly. With the narrative today is China, through its unfair behavior, stole our jobs, undermined our economy, stole our technology, disadvantaged us. China did a lot of things that are despicable, but they didn't steal our jobs. That boards of directors sitting in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco made fiduciarily responsible jobs to maximize earnings for shareholders and relocated facilities, some of which went to China. most of which went someplace first. Went to Japan, moved from Japan to Taiwan, moved from Taiwan to South Korea, then made it to China, now moving out of China, going to Vietnam or Indonesia or other places. That the key decisions here were made for understandable economic reasons in the United States. I'm happy to talk more about this, but where I want to leave this section of the talk is that politicians and people generally often find it more convenient, more attractive, more appealing to blame somebody else than to accept responsibility. I am a great fan of the philosopher of the swamp, no longer practicing, in Pogo, the comic strip character. And Pogo very famously observed, "We have met the enemy, and it's us. We have problems that we have to address. We choose to blame it on another. We're unhappy with many things in the international system to explain, well, we got this problem with Brazil, and that problem with Italy, and another problem with Greece, and this one with Indonesia." That's kind of confusing and clumsy. So we put them all in one place, a fictional place. Let's call it China. China also happens to be a real place, but it is the symbolic embodiment of a lot of things that Americans are unhappy about. We pay more attention to China because it's bigger. Its behavior is more egregious than that of other, and it matters more because of the size of the economy, size of the population, size of the military budget, size of the nuclear arsenal. That superlatives mean letting China slide, not addressing the problems in the relationship entails bigger consequences. But size makes it harder to work on the problems. We could solve some of these problems with Haiti and nobody'd notice, right? With China, they matter. So we've got a narrative here that China's unfair, quasi-illegal, outside of treaty commitments behavior, stealing intellectual property, cyber theft, and so forth. Access to our economy without granting comparable access to the Chinese economy. Restrictions on flow of information, one way. A lot of actions here in this economic juggernaut. 40 years of double-digit growth. People extrapolating into the future, if not quite the same rate of growth, but also very rapid. Its military has grown dramatically. It's going to continue to grow at that level. Its number of college graduates has grown dramatically. It'll continue to grow. They've already got so many more engineers than the United States does. And these engineers will be better quality coming out in the future than they are in the past. That an unstoppable juggernaut, reinforced by this is a rising power that inevitably will clash with the status quo, current leading power of the United States. In the most extreme versions of this, there's nothing you can do about it, right? This is inevitable. Rising powers confront the status quo power. There's nothing about China's rise, U.S.-China relations, that is inevitable or immutable. There's all kinds of room for political decision-making to change trajectories and address problems. I'll come back to that. But this narrative of a rising China that we've got to respond to everywhere. Tit for tat. They put one more military installation on an artificial island in the South China Sea. If we don't respond, we've lost all our international credibility. They passed laws that restrict the operation of non-governmental organizations in China. We have to shut down the Confucius Institutes in the United States. That kind of thinking. And somehow that's going to prolong the period before the Chinese overtake us. It's defective thinking in many responses. The narrative, I think, has many causes. One is this simple-minded extrapolation. China grew this fast in the past, it'll grow that fast in the future. It won't. But there are others. Now, the order I will give is a little bit reflective of kind of where we are in a national laboratory that does defense work. Partly it's justification for an $800 billion defense budget. You actually have to have an enemy. But we have a big defense budget in part for security reasons, but in part because it's the primary vehicle in the United States for redistribution of income. Built up over the 70 years of the Cold War. It's how subsidized, California, Massachusetts, New York subsidized Arkansas and Alabama, Mississippi, through their military bases or contracting. Redistribution is good. It's necessary. We are one country. We choose to do it or have evolved into doing it through the defense budget because people don't fight over it as much politically. And over the years, we have put more and more stuff into the national security basket because you can't get increased education funding. You can't get certain types of healthcare funding. You can't build seawalls to protect against sea level rise without getting in a political, put it in this, everybody's for national security and stuff goes through. At some point we'll have to untangle this, but you have to have an enemy worthy of the name. You also have to have an enemy if we're going to rebuild our capacity. You don't build it in the abstract, you got to build it with reference to some capabilities. We also make China into something beyond what it is to motivate ourselves. And I'm old enough to have witnessed the Sputnik moment, that when we launched tremendous efforts to rebuild infrastructure, rebuild education, raise the quality of our labor force, so we didn't lose the space race, that we did not allow the Soviet Union to surpass us or maintain a lead in it was a motivator. We built the National Defense Highway System. Today we call it the Interstate Highway System. I went to grad school on the National Defense Education Act. We had to learn more about other countries. So part of the use China to galvanize us, motivate us to do things. Some of you may remember one of President Obama's State of the Union address in which he tried to prod the country to more high-speed internet connectivity. That it is kind of appalling given the capabilities that we have, including Palo Alto, right? It had such a slow internet system. The example was South Korea that he used. South Korea met fantastic accomplishments, good thing to do, benefits. Nobody got motivated because the South Koreans were outperforming us. China can at least have a chance of being more effectively used. There are broader reasons. One is the erosion of what I'll call the Cold War consensus, that the United States could and should assume a disproportionate burden for maintenance of international stability, for the security of other nations. The kind of, we carry a heavier burden than our allies and partners do. That was accepted, deliberate, part of the strategy. The other was the United States would use its economic strength and be more open to our partners, because this would help them to become stronger. It would tie them to us economically. It would make it possible for values to shape a rules-based system. It was all quite deliberate. China was brought into that, but that consensus of accepting a disproportionate burden, accepting asymmetries in international relations, developed when there was a bipolar world, right? If you were sort of in the US-led club, you got the opportunities here, and if you weren't, you didn't have those advantages. So the asymmetries didn't matter if the country was allied with Moscow or it was not aligned and not aligned with anybody on it. But 30 years after the demise of the Soviet Union, the American public, I think quite understandably, says, why are we still doing this? It made sense then. It doesn't seem to make much sense now. Our partners are prosperous. They're capable of bearing a larger share of the burden. So you get this partly in a defense debate, mostly in an economic debate. Why do we grant greater access to technology, to capital, to training, to markets than others accord to us? Why do we accept asymmetries and not demand reciprocity? Perfectly reasonable question. China policy is affected by this larger rethinking of our role in the world. But China gets special attention, and correctly, it's so big. It has done more to exploit the opportunities of the asymmetric relationship with greater consequences. And part of this was deliberate. Again, the expected US policy, they'll become more integrated into and snared by and meshed in the global order. It'll constrain them as it constrains us. We're the biggest player, but think of Gulliver and the Lilliputians tying him down. That's what multilateral organizations are designed to do, to constrain the big guys. It's why most major powers resist multilateral control regimes and so forth. The US is anomalous in history by seeing this as a way to enhance our own security and prosperity. The final, how do you explain the current mode here, is that Chinese actions have alienated more or less every constituency in the United States that cared about the relationship. The most important of these is the business community. That the business community, until about 5-6 years ago, was consistently the strongest, most forceful, most effective advocate for stability in the relationship. That Brad referred to the pattern of successive administrations moving to more or less the same policy, which is accurate. But part of the dynamic was this fictional place, let's call it China, that figured prominently in presidential election campaigns as a convenient simplification to make points about foreign policy. And the day after the election, whoever won is all metaphorical. The business community would come to the winner and say, about this campaign rhetoric, about this China bashing shit, that was fine for the campaign, now get real. This is about real money. This is about relationships that took us a long time to develop. This is about sunk costs. This is about value change, production change, supplier change, that you don't change those overnight, so get real and get with the program. And pretty quickly, each administration came back to its tweaking of the engagement policy that was adopted in the Carter administration. But the business community that for about a decade and a half saw problems that figure prominently today. As a bureaucrat on the inside, bureaucrats would go to the business community and say, you want us to do something about this? Should we go? And the business community, no, stay out of it. Don't politicize it. We can work this. We don't want to make it harder to solve because the government weighs in on non-market behavior, failure to honor international and bilateral commitments, demands for transfer of technology in order to have market access. Stay away. Don't politicize it. And the government said, okay, in part because successive administrations dealing with the Balkans, war on terror, collapse of the economy, world economy in the Great Recession, and so forth, had plenty of other things to do, to worry about. So defer China. But deferral of these issues didn't cause them to heal themselves. They got worse, not better. And the business community, 5, 6 years ago, flipped. And it said, government, please come in on this. We don't want to be the bad guy. We don't want to run the risks here of taking actions to compel Chinese behavioral changes. You do it on behalf of everybody. You be the heavy, and we'll come in and benefit. No matter who got elected in 2016, these issues would have had to be addressed. Other constituencies, again, very briefly, academics. That in my view, these Chinese efforts to use students and postdocs and research projects to plunder American intellectual and property technology advances are way, way overstated. But restrictions on what American academic students, researchers can do in China, on NGOs and religious organizations. The mill-to-mill relationship that is essentially frozen. There's not a constituency that hasn't moved from the be patient with China, stick with the basic program, it's working, that hasn't flipped to the what we did in the past is not adequate for the problems today. So we've got to be hard on China environment here that is predicated in part on a characterization of China that I believe is wildly wrong and greatly exaggerated. And let me, in a few minutes, summarize that. The summary is drawn out of a new book that I've co-edited with Jean Oy, that challenges China faces. I mentioned the double-digit growth continuing for about as long as the Asian tigers. But it's not grown at double-digit rates any longer. 2009 was the last time. It's officially down to 6%. 6% is still pretty good rate of growth, but I know of nobody inside China or inside the China watching community who believes it's 6%. That's the propaganda number on here. That you begin to look at things like electricity usage, which is way too low to support 6% growth. But the important thing is China's economy has reached a state of development that, like every other economy in the world, it flattens out. It's flattened out as a middle-income country. Comparisons sometimes are telling. All of the other Asian tigers and the non-Asian late developing countries that made it rapid growth plateau, They plateaued after they'd made it into high income status. China didn't. China plateaued as a middle income country. Does that matter? Maybe. Maybe. I'm going to put some numbers on it. The status of a high income country, it's a World Bank moving figure that right now is $12,700, more or less, 736. I don't know what the meaning of precision of $36 is, that kind of an estimate, but China's $3,000 below that. China's a middle-income country. It's proven difficult for middle-income countries to make that transition. How difficult? 50 years ago, according to the World Bank, there were 63 countries with the status that China has today. 50 years later, 13 have graduated. Only one of those 13 had as many as 30 million people. That was South Korea. Indeed, economists refer to the difficulty of this transition as the middle income trap, making the transition from imitation to innovation, moving beyond the national champion favored industrial planning enterprises into something else. Maybe China's huge size and population will make it easier to make the transition, but maybe not. China has grown impressively, but its GDP per capita, it's a middling country. Just about the same as Equatorial Guinea. Nobody that I've read lately considers Equatorial Guinea a juggernaut about to overtake the major powers. Others that are more or less comparable are Mexico and Turkey in there. That this is significant, I think, on several respects. One is, why do we think China is a major player? Why do we refer to it as a superpower? Why do we think it is the only peer competitor for the United States? Mostly because of its economic performance, because it is the second largest economy in the world. So if you're in, give or take, 192 other countries and you look at China, say, wow, major power because of its rapid growth, size of its economy. What's the impression of China when growth slows? And if it doesn't make that transition quickly into higher income status, it's also significant because the party has committed to the people of China that they're going to make this transition in the next 25 years. Maybe they will. I hope they don't falter and too badly, but it's a real challenge. Slower growth affects expectations, but also affects possibilities. Let me go at some of them, and very quickly. Not only has China reached an economic turning point, it's plateauing of growth. There's another one economists refer to as the Lewis point. Lewis point is when you run out of unskilled labor in the countryside that can move into a higher productivity factory job. China's hit that point. Its growth over the last 4 decades was fueled in part by movement from the countryside to the cities, in part by increases in population. Not much. How many workers were added over 40 years? 400 million. 400 million. You don't have to do very much work when you multiply it by 400 million to get a jump in GDP. But the population is no longer growing. It's flat. And it begins to decline in a year or two. That means China's got to rely on improvements in human capital, education, for future growth. It's made major improvements in education, but on many other, now comes the hard part. 50% of China's population still lives in rural areas. That means 50% of the future workforce is going to come out of rural areas. Rural areas, almost nobody goes beyond middle school. Why don't they go beyond middle school? Like a lot of reasons. One is, why would you go to school? You can go get a job in the city that pays a lot of money. Second is, high schools in the rural areas in China are, it's a function of average income, the most expensive in the world. They're not state funded, they're tuition funded. It's not high in absolute sense, but to send a kid to high school takes more than the annual income of a family. And so families say, don't go. There's another problem, again, with Chinese surveys here, that nutritional problems and nurturing problems in the countryside. Kids that have been left in the care of their grandparents or parents have gone off to the cities. By age 3, 50% have suffered permanent intellectual damage. They're limited, they can't learn, or they're limited as to how much they can learn. Again, this is nutritional, primarily. Can China fix this? Yeah. Is it trying to fix it? Not yet, because it's had other priorities. So, but that's the problem. You need more teachers. You build more schools, that's easy. Train more teachers, that takes a while. Get kids to stay in school, that takes a while. Change the nutrition, that takes a while. But demographic, people-centered problems or challenges, another reason. China is an aging society. It's been said for a long time, accurately, it'll be the first country in history to get old before it gets rich. What do we mean by China gets old? Within the next 5 years, China's over age 60 population will exceed the total population of the United States. Within a decade, its over 80 age population will exceed the population of France. Lots of implications of this. Slow, flat, and then declining population growth. 40 years ago, the dependency ratio, the number of children and elderly retirees supported by each worker, right? It was 16 to 1. It's 4 to 1 today, on its way to 2 to 1. That's pretty daunting. Healthcare requirements of an elderly population. It's not contagious diseases and broken legs. It's coronary disease, it's cancer, it's diabetes, and oh yeah, dementia and Alzheimer's. These are expensive. Whose responsibility is it? Right now, as throughout Chinese history, it's the family. Family has to take care of the elderly. Seems right. Was the system developed when people had 6, 7 children? 3 or 4 survived to adulthood. We have now 2 generations of 1 child per family. Policy has been lifted, but fertility rate continues to decline here. That means if you're a 25-year-old couple starting your career in China, you can look forward to supporting 4 parents and 8 grandparents, unless the state comes up with some type of insurance coverage. Elder care. That is going to cost money. Where's that coming from? China now spends 6.4% of its GDP on health. That's way less than the 18% we squander on health, but it's less, considerably less than most developed countries spend on it. Developed countries spend it because social contract right? People expect state to play a role in this. How do you do it? Where does that money come from? How do you distribute it? Right now, as that kind of benefit, social benefits are distributed through workplace. Unless a lot more money goes into urban workplaces, unless the pie expands, the people who receive those benefits currently get a smaller slice. They're not so big on adding more workers to this thing. All of these are complicated. The aspirations of the people, ordinary people, the middle class, the give or take 350 million that meet basic middle class sort of education, income, urban kind of status, want stuff from the government, from the system. And they're not shy about making their wants known. And social media has completely transformed the ability of an authoritarian state to control information. Even things that are taken down are up for a matter of seconds or minutes and spread across the country. That means the way in which the government deals with any local problem becomes known to the whole country and the outside world. If they respond in a capitulationist way, meet the demands of the public to remove an official because he's ineffective or corrupt or whatever it is, then that's not the only ineffective leader in China. Others can do. If they react coercively, the repression is broadcast around. This is a lose-lose proposition for a regime that wants to control information. Two more things here. One is the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese foreign aid, the Chinese infrastructure development, which by the last figure I thought has something like 170 countries that have signed on to this in some way or other. I have no idea what that means. But basically, this is a way for China to take excess capacity. It overbuilt phenomenally in things like cement, steel, construction equipment, construction gangs. It built this marvelous infrastructure that'll never be paid for. It doesn't charge enough to do maintenance on airport terminals and high-speed rails. So they got to raise the prices to pay for it and anger the people or pay the people more. Again, everything's interconnected. But Belt and Road, that the world thought, the developed world, this is great. The Chinese are going to pay to develop my country. Chinese people say, why are we giving more money? Why are we giving our money to people who have a higher income than we do? And there's no good answer, right, from the government. So not much of this stuff is grants, it's loans. And China has discovered that if you loan money to deadbeat countries to build projects that didn't get built earlier because they were judged to be not economically viable, you're probably not going to get repaid. So as they've imposed constraints and conditions and strings to protect the people's investment, they've alienated potential partners in this. That 6 years into Belt and Road, it's created more antagonists and disgruntled partners than it has allies and soft power. But it is good for sustaining growth, right? It's kind of Lenin, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. You export your excess capacity. And finally, the military buildup, which has produced backlash. Everything from U.S. revising national security strategy, nuclear posture review, other countries that had drifted towards a more neutralist position, not wanting to be too close to China or too close to the United States, more than drifting, running to get closer to the United States on this, or closer to India, or closer to Japan. It's sort of if you had to develop a strategy, if you wanted to develop a strategy in China designed to drive your neighbors into the arms of countries you worry about to increase your own security problem, you'd do pretty much what China did. So they now have this big military, which is impressive in many respects. How are they going to pay for it? It's in zero-sum competition with all of the other things I mentioned and many that I haven't. Making the case that China must do this because it's besieged by aggressive neighbors, or the United States determined to contain, constrain, thwart China's rise, is a tough argument to make, particularly when you said, okay, even though that's true, I still need somebody to pay for grandma. I still need somebody to pay for the health care. I still need some long-term care arrangements so I can go to work instead of staying home and take care of aging parents. All of these challenges are interconnected. That to keep moving forward, China has to find ways to respond to all of them. Otherwise, it's got too many weak links in it. If you don't do education, you can't move to higher levels of the technical sophistication ladder for industry or defense or whatever. But growth is slowing, demand is increasing, and people are much more aware and articulate in raising demands. So the future is not going to look like the past. I don't know what decisions Beijing's going to make. I don't know what priorities the public is going to set. But a straight line projection from China over the last 3-4 decades is almost certain to be wrong. So very briefly, on the what's the right policy to deal with this? I mean, I believe our policies ought to be, first of all, grounded in what do we think we need to do for ourselves, addressing the pogo problem here, but also a proper understanding of China among others. And I'll just focus on China. That whatever we project out as the problems we're going to have to meet, we can be pretty confident that worst case projections will be wrong. They're understandable, particularly in the military realm. If you build for the possibility they got 1,000 tanks and it turns out they only have 100, it's a pretty good day. But if you plan for 100 and they got 1,000, that's a bad day. So worst casing for some stuff makes sense. But for a total, complex, multifaceted relationship, if you go for the worst case, you can't get there from here. So you got to have some more realistic, but hedged. You can't be Pollyannish. You got to be realistic, and you got to build in the possibility that you're wrong, or wrong in part. That's calling for a reasonably sophisticated policy. Going back to the Cold War, it was a policy that we took leadership, but developed friends, partners, allies. That the operable number or construct was not what does the United States as a country bring to the table, but what does the United States plus its allies, economically, technologically, militarily. That seemed to me a pretty good strategy, a pretty effective one. Currently, we've walked away from that, or are walking away from it, or have to do something. But for China, the three broad possibilities that have been sketched out are solve the current spate of problems. Again, they're mostly economic. The most serious are economic. In my view, they're soluble problems. We've learned a lot over 40 years of actually working problems together. We've solved a lot more than we have failed to solve. We know how to do this. Both sides know how to do it. But solve the problems, and it goes back to the status quo ante. the kind of engagement that was practiced for 40 years. I don't think that's possible, in part because, again, this larger consensus about how we ought to interact with the world has broken down. So how China fits into it, we have to have the larger framework that reprioritizes things that we do, that reconceives, may revalidate, but we need another zero-based look at this, and assumptions that it'll go back to the way it was in 2007. It won't. And I just don't see how that's possible. The other extreme is decoupling, containment. American side, people refer to decoupling. We ought to separate our economy from the Chinese economy. We ought to pursue our objectives in the world without reference to China. From the Chinese side, it's containment, reinvigoration of a containment policy. U.S. followed a containment policy towards China for not quite 20 years. It started when they signed an alliance with Moscow, and it ended with the Sino-Soviet split and clashes on the border, and a recognition that U.S. could take advantage of the friction, the Nixon-Mao. This is not, even if it were possible, it doesn't make any sense, because it's to give away leverage. What the Chinese see as vulnerabilities of dependency and interdependency is valid in terms of it gives us a lot of influence. And us isn't just us, it's the rules-based international order in which others have a stake in this. We should never be alone. We need not be alone. This should be all of those with common concerns that requires effective diplomacy, military diplomacy, economic diplomacy, political diplomacy, and the like. The economic divisions of labor, the size of the China market, the significance of existing arrangements that you don't want to go back and start again, that if things that are evolving anyway, as labor costs, energy costs, insurance costs, all of these things change. Production moves around the world and will likely continue to move around the world. And the reason I gave the numbers 78 and today on the U.S., we've benefited. We want to continue to benefit, not just with China, but with our trading relations more broadly. That leaves a third one, which is some variant of a retooled, hedged engagement. Can't separate ourselves, shouldn't try to separate ourselves from China. If we try to separate ourselves, make China the de facto enemy, we got third country problems out the wazoo. Not to mention, there are a lot of real problems that we face, the world faces. Why would you not want to have access to 20% of the world's brain power to work on those problems? Why would you want to run the risk of having incompatible approaches to difficult, costly problems? China's still going to have a permanent seat on the Security Council. China's going to remain a big economy. There was sort of, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. So we need to work with them. I'll close with is this anything more than a long-winded justification for the engagement policy that Fingar was engaged in formulating and administering, that says it was a pretty good approach in the past, it'll be a pretty good approach in the future? To me, I think the key to the argument is, what's China going to do? And what can China do? That 1978, China going to be autarkic, get in, get out, jumpstart, minimize its engagement, not be entrapped in the rules-based system. I didn't believe then they could do that. I believe more strongly today they can't do it. That's not an option. That they got to the point they are today, upper middle income country, many, many people into the middle class, eliminated abject poverty for hundreds of millions. Abject poverty is like $2.25 a day. That's not being rich. But they've pulled a lot of people up. Tremendous accomplishments. They did that by working with us within the rules-based liberal order, accepting ever higher degrees of enmeshment, engagement, constraint. They began to pull back 2008, 2009. I don't think it's a coincidence that that's where growth begins to slow. As China has become more restrictive, more repressive at home, has reduced its engagement with the outside world, or has ceased expanding its involvement in it, its economic performance has declined. With economic performance declining, so is legitimacy of the regime. 70% of China's population knows nothing except sustained high rates of growth, improvements of living standard. They're not real impressed by what parents and grandparents say about don't push for too much too soon. We don't want to lose what we just got. And they're even less impressed by the party telling them how much the regime did for grandma and grandpa, or great-grandma and grandpa, the liberation, the defeat of the Japanese occupation, the recovery of Chinese occupied territory, ending colonialism, all of which is mythology, but it carries no weight. You've got a population that is making demand. I think China has no real option except to gradually move back to the kind of participation in the global system that it undertook tentatively 4 decades ago. And if it does that, it'll continue to grow. But it's a manageable problem. We know how to manage a successful country. We don't have any idea how to manage a stumbling country the size of China, as powerful as China. That's the worst outcome is a failed regime. Let me stop there.